Annie Hampson was, until earlier this year, the Chief Planning Officer and Development Director for the City of London. She joined the corporation in 1989 and has overseen the radical transformation of the square mile from the grand scrapers of the early days of Big Bang to the towers of the Eastern Cluster. So the NLA's exhibition and report on the changing face of London was launched at the beginning of September. It covers 15 years that NLA has been in existence and has shown how London has catered for the massive growth of the last 2 decades. And the city is one of the key areas studied in the exhibition, which is on show at the moment in Store Street. And there's also another display in the city centre in Guildhall. So Annie, can you say something about how planning works in the city? I mean, it's subtly different to other local authorities. I think Michael Wellbank, the former chairman of the planning committee, who sadly died recently, used to describe it as more like a development corporation. Would you agree with that description?
Yes and no, I think is the right answer to that question. As I'm sure you're aware, the city did have exactly the same planning responses, the same planning duties as any other local authority. And it has to exercise those appropriately and have regard to the same things as everybody else. However, having sort of said that, I think there are things about the city that make it rather different. As in a way, the reference probably makes. It is slightly different constituted. It has a relatively small residential population, which means that some of the issues around residential get in so many other areas, don't apply to the same degree. And it is of itself a quite significant property owner, which does mean to some degree that again it can sort of influence things. And I think it's probably also true to say, because of that sort of constitution, because of the way it's made up, it absolutely has a focus on the development of sort of London's World Financial Centre. And in doing that, probably absolutely of necessity, has a very sort of global outlook to that commitment. Which in some ways made it such an exciting place to work. It is a very sort of global place, very far-reaching sort of thoughts about where it should be going, what it should be doing, and recognising it doesn't in a way need to address that purely in terms of a British context, but also in a global context.
So the Eastern Cluster is now a globally recognised image of London and reflects the ability of the city to adapt and change to meet the needs of the business community. How did that actually start? Because it was a time when the city was really much keener on ground scrapers than tall towers, wasn't there?
That was the case. There was a sort of broad sort of view that the city probably should not be an overly high-rise sort of city. There was also at that stage a very big drive to accommodate the very big sort of banking halls, and also the requirement for very, very large floor plates. But as you say, with the advent of Canary Wharf, change and recognition that in fact much of the city requirement is in fact for quite small scale offices, not actually for the very, very big players. In some ways skyscrapers became a very obvious and potential solution to delivering floor space. And I think one of the things that unquestionably was absolutely critical was the 1992 bombs, which destroyed the Baltic Exchange. And after sort of many, many negotiations, many of which were to put the building back, eventually out of that emerged the Gherkin. And I think those of us who were involved in the Gherkin realised what an incredibly sort of important decision that was, not only in terms of the building itself, but in terms of the new approach that might be adopted to delivering the increase of floor space that was recognised to be needed in the city. Also, as I think we've discussed at the NLA, there are some very complex sort of overriding issues that make the Eastern Cluster one of the few areas, even within the city, where you can deliver tall buildings That's because of the aviation heights, the strategic views, the listed buildings, the conservation areas, the setting of supports and support heights. That means it's very tight cluster. I understand the city, in fact, is now wanting to call the city cluster rather than the eastern cluster, did begin to emerge and created this extraordinarily dense and sort of vibrant area of tall buildings, which, as you say, is now absolutely part of the London skyline.
Well, I suppose also related to that is that the city has also been a leader in delivering improvements to streets and spaces. So as well as going up, it improves the streetscape, and also, I mean, its current transport strategy takes these policies even further, doesn't it? As it's a sort of exemplar, I think, for other inner city areas. And the high level of commuters that you have coming into the city, or vast majority arrive via active travel. So it's very much of its time, isn't it? So the city really is a sort of historic walking environment as well. It still has the shape of the medieval city. So do you see that as a really sort of positive shift, and something that actually will be accelerated by COVID-19 probably?
I mean, a very positive, absolutely essential, and also, as you say, it's something that hopefully, in this horrible crisis, that may be accelerated, as you say. I mean, it was almost born out of necessity. As the city was increasing its working population to sort of 550,000, that does put enormous pressure on the streets. Also, these buildings, by their very nature, they need to be serviced, etc. And also, the gender of sort of well-being emerging, etc., and people's demands for sort of exercise, running, etc. There was a real focus on how can we actually create space almost where there isn't space in the city. So that's either almost using the streets, or, as you know, we've also been very much encouraging sort of roof gardens and roof spaces, again, to be used that sort of way. So the city, as you say, is looking very much to how can we facilitate these things. We were very early in negotiating for cycle spaces in office buildings. I do remember being laughed at and ridiculed in meetings 20 years ago for requiring cycling spaces, and nobody will cycle. There was still the thing that senior executives won't cycle, and we've seen how that has changed. Such that, in fact, however much cycling provision you provide in buildings, it's almost never enough. So that has changed hugely. Indeed, the necessity of, in a way, prioritizing pedestrian movements in the city, particularly timed closures, potentially not necessarily full closures, but timed closures, particularly to recognise the rush hours and lunchtime. Also, we're very much seeking to consolidate deliveries to buildings so that they are delivered elsewhere and then consolidated such that there are far less vehicles. And that also facilitates us requiring them not to have any deliveries during peak time. Probably a focus more on sort of evening deliveries, except where they are close to residents. And then coming back to Michael, in fact, one of the things that I think spearheaded was the Bank Junction improvements, and where there was this hideous movement, where vehicles were really prioritised over pedestrians, and that has fundamentally changed now. And in a way, I think the degree to which that has worked in a way encouraged others and the city to think, how far can we go? So I think it's a trend that will go on, and it's very necessary, I think. And as you say, with COVID, it's almost become more necessary to think how they might respond to this in a positive way.
So, I mean, the present crisis has been described as an existential threat to central areas like the city and to the West End. How do you think, in planning terms, they need to respond?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because that, in a way, is a rather sort of pressing place to be, isn't it? You think out of sort of bad things, it's always in some ways the most positive thing to think, well, what can we do about it? How can we make it better? And I think there probably is a very real recognition that the office workplace will change. There will be more working at home. This idea that you had to be present in order to be delivering, I think really thankfully is a thing of the past. But I think equally the need for people to communicate, to intermingle with each other, to sort of be part of an office environment, I think it will absolutely remain. And to some degree, that is probably true of sort of the West End as equally, that while people won't necessarily shop again in quite the same way, there still is, we've talked so much over these last few weeks about the need to touch. It's not only each other, but it's also things, isn't it? And be part of experiences and, our need for culture and well-being. So I think probably sort of both the city and sort of the West End really need to think about how, in a way, they can respond in a positive way to bringing people sort of back into the city. I mean, I think we all have to hope that this is to some degree a passing phase. That's not that the life will necessarily go back to the way it was, but hopefully we might have a sort of better life, with a greater focus on sort of well-being, more sort of regard to the whole sort of green sort of sustainability agenda. If we don't grasp this now, in a way, a sad opportunity will not have been realised.
But perhaps the COVID also makes it even more important that the tulip actually happens as an attractor to the city in a post-COVID environment.
Potentially, that must be right. Exactly. As you know, there is a public inquiry in November, and there are opposers to it, the Mayor and Historic England, in relation to the setting of the Tower of London and other heritage assets. But the city, I think, does remain of the view that on balance the benefits of the scheme, for the very reasons that you said, do outweigh and do provide something exciting and different for London and a new attractor.
Well, thank you very much, Annie, for sharing your thoughts. And as I said, the exhibition "Changing Face of London" is up at the moment, and the changing face of the city plays a key part in that exhibition, and you played a key part in delivering that changing face of the city. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and it's always been a very exciting time. Yeah, thank you.